So I think we're all sorted then. That's good. So I have the great pleasure of having the time directly after lunch, which normally means everybody's in their coma. So I'm hoping that the topic in itself will already wake some people up. And it's going to be, I already promised that, a bit uncomfortable. Because we are brought up with the idea that nuclear weapons are eternally bad and nuclear weapons do not hold any military value. And that's something I'm actually contesting on certain levels. Especially because the nuclear weapon itself, especially when it comes to tactical nuclear weapons, but we're going into detail in a bit, is actually an inherently maneuverist weapon. It's actually there to break up a stalemate. And it's actually there to create a decisive condition in its outcome. But obviously, because of a destructive purpose, we're actually looking at a weapon which is inherently strategic due to its military value. And therefore, what I want to talk about is not nuclear deterrence with the big weapons, because we talk about that a lot, and there's a lot of debate at the moment about a nuclear deterrent for the European Union, etc. What I want to talk about is really tactical nuclear warfighting. And it's an essential part of NATO's nuclear doctrine. And I know it's highly, highly contestable. However, NATO is foremost a nuclear alliance, if we like it or not. Our basic bedrock is the nuclear promise of the United States of America. And the sharing of these weapons guarantee us a certain influence on their use. However, we do not hold an institutional veto over them. So, what I want to do is do some myth busting. Because normally, when you talk about nuclear weapons, people tell you one of these wonderful 5 things. We're going to go through them in a bit. The trouble is that when we're talking about the nuclear weapons, normally comes up a nuclear war cannot be won and should not be fought. What picture, and I just want to have 1 or 2 opinions, do you have about a nuclear war? What does it entail, and where do you get, the picture from? Anybody? Yeah.
That scene in Terminator 2, where everything is devastated and you only have
Exactly. Good. Anybody else? Yeah.
I don't believe nuclear holocaust. I think that's just made up theory to scare people off of nuclear weapons. What I believe is that the effects of, if strategic nuclear weapons were used, massive devastation on the economy and a lot of lost life. But
okay. Yeah, so that's already quite good. I was already hoping for some Marvel fans here, because there's normally, like these scenes of massive missile strikes, and where all the missiles getting started at once, and the world ends, and pretty much nothing can be done about it. Nobody makes sense of it, and militaries or military personnel are often depicted as crazy or not rational, right? So I want to break that up. So when we talk about nuclear weapons, that they do not hold military value, this is something which came up quite a lot in the Ukraine war. However, I'm going to go back 2 years now. At the beginning of the war, the United States of America were highly, highly concerned about the use of tactical nuclear weapons. It was even going that far that in September 2022, the United States made explicit threats against the use of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. However, and this is something we don't know, how far the Russians actually went, because we have the intercepts about Russian units, especially the 12th Directorate, which holds all nuclear warheads, and they already apparently moved some of them. So for a limited strike, there's always a possibility. So now to the military value. What can I do with them? If I adjust the yield, and I mean below a kiloton, I can actually use them effectively against fortifications or against troop formations. It depends how I'm using them, if I use an air burst, if I use a deep earth penetrator. That goes too much detail, but just to let you know, I have much more firepower available on a much smaller scale than if I use conventional weapons. And if I use these miniaturized nuclear weapons, which have been in development for quite some time, especially in the Russian Federation, but also in NATO, we actually hold the same firepower equivalent to about 50 fighter aircraft, if not more. So, they will never be used is the next myth. How many bombs have been used? And okay, let's say the 2 in anger, all right, but how many nuclear weapons have been detonated on planet Earth since 1945? Any suggestion?
Tests also. Also tests.
The tests, yeah. Okay, so a lot, yeah, that's good. We have about 600 tests over ground and about 350 of them as tactical nuclear weapons. So when you look at the pictures from the 1950s of US soldiers, you have the situation that they actually walk towards the atomic explosion. And they were supposed to fight in there. And it's actually something nuclear doctrine, or especially the doctrine of NATO, was all about until 1990. And I'm highly contesting the idea that tactical nuclear weapons were then just, well, they were, outlived and now we have precision-guided munitions. No, we do not. Yeah, I mean, we do have, but we do not have the same firepower for it. Then, can only be used in combined arms operations. What I mean with that is, the next myth which comes up is, I need an elite force to actually exploit a breakthrough with nuclear weapons. It depends on how I operate. So let's turn it around a little bit. And I want to really challenge the morality a little bit. All right? So the Russian side, if I look at Sabbat 13, Sabbat 15, and so forth, and the operational backgrounds of them, they would actually use even conscripts as a breakthrough force, and then decontaminate them at the end. So, if we look at nuclear weapons, that's highly surprising. So why would we not do that at the end of the day if we had to fight in it? I'm not saying I want to, but be prepared for it. And then, a nuclear use would always alter the type of conflict. So this is something I get a lot from older officers, and a lot at let's say, German decision makers in particular, because it should then just be strategic. The trouble is, as we've seen with Ukraine, what would really happen if Russia used tactical nuclear weapons? Some say there's an automatism in it, but if I go with the escalation cycle, or an escalation ladder, it might be also good to just use a conventional weapon instead, or have alternative setbacks for the Russian Federation. But an automatic reply to a nuclear weapon usage on a small scale, I would highly debate, especially if none of our essential interests are at stake. Which brings me to the last part. So when we talk about it at NATO, and this is something I had a great debate last week in Paris about that. Before that, we had sub-strategic weapons, which is an equivalent to tactical nuclear weapons, and we had strategic weapons. Since last week, they declared it only to be strategic. Now, I'm, for clear definitions, and I'm basically saying that if I declare everything strategic, nothing is. And if I do not have a clarity, especially as a military officer, about what kind of weapon I'm using and for what purpose, because it's anyway all socially constructed, then I have no clarity whatsoever. Which brings me to nuclear deterrence, and just stick with me here. I know that's a bit theory-laden, but it's just for the moment, just to clarify for tactical nuclear weapons. So normally we talk about it that an actor has to be rational in order to actually hold nuclear weapons and make them usable or not usable. Rationality, however, what's rational? And that's actually what I'm coming down to. Rational is always in the eye of the beholder. It's the personal background, it's the institutional background of all people involved, especially with nuclear planning, because it's always only focused on the president or the decision maker of the time. However, yes, he or she makes the decision, but as we all know as military officers, I am preparing as a staff officer the options for the higher echelons. So therefore, we have to actually really look into what constitutes rationality and for whom. Then we have the clear cost-benefit analysis where people are telling me, a nuclear weapon is too costly and it will cost ultimately. Well, if we look at the war in Ukraine, that's also highly debatable whether it's actually a proper cost-benefit analysis. It might be for the Russian Federation exactly that it's actually a benefit to use them. Maybe to end the war quicker, maybe to have a breakthrough. And then we have this one model of nuclear deterrence. And that what brings me what my paper is all about and also the presentation is all about. That we focus on strategic level decision making in nuclear deterrence theory. We do not really deal, aside from Herman Kahn quickly, we do not deal with low level nuclear usage. I'm talking about maybe using 3 or 5 nuclear weapons and basically having an escalation detour, so to speak, and basically escalate so that a conflict does not escalate. So coming down to this escalate to de-escalate dynamic, which is often attributed to the Russian Federation. However, that's actually NATO doctrine since the 1960s. So, well, if we then talk about nuclear weapons, there's often the main part that we need to talk about the credibility. If I would use them. I don't know if there's any Yes Prime Minister fans in the room, or they know about that. There's a wonderful scene where the Prime Minister gets asked, would you press the button? And he's first, yes, I will absolutely press the button. And then he, goes through scenarios, like the firefighters who move into Western Berlin, or some small infantry battalions which move across the border. And then he becomes less sure if we actually want to use it. So my point is, if we declare it strategic, we declare it with such a high cost that we're not going to use it in the time where we actually would need them. But to that more in a second. So, in order to have a credible nuclear threat, we actually need to have a credible nuclear doctrine, which means a vision of how to win a nuclear war. Yes, I know, uncomfortable. However, by winning, I don't mean necessarily that I won an all-out war, but the question is if I can shorten the war. And that's an argument to be had, I think. Because yes, we haven't fought a nuclear war yet, but we need to talk about it, because the consequences would be dire, especially for our troops on the ground. Plausible nuclear warfighting doctrine comes with that. And this is something where decision makers aren't afraid to actually participate in exercises. That's a problem which is inherent in NATO nuclear doctrine since the 1960s. Because decision makers, not even in the Cold War, had the guts or the interest to actually participate in the nuclear exercises. So especially in Germany, the German Chancellor never participated, none of them, in any nuclear exercise as a decision maker. They always sent somebody else. And that's also the reason why we have the nuclear planning group. It's not because, everybody else wanted to be interested in it. No. The US actually wanted to raise awareness about nuclear issues, and that's what a nuclear planning group is all about. So we can lie to us all we want, but when we look in the archive material, it's not about the Europeans who are interested in nuclear. It's more, actually gaining the interest. And then we have the political will to execute, which comes with it. So if I am a participant of the nuclear sharing arrangement, which is often declared as a NATO arrangement, but it's actually always a bilateral agreement between the participating nation and the United States of America. And they get a custodian unit and nuclear weapons associated with them. So therefore, there's a clear-cut channel for communication established as soon as that happens. However, when it comes to the usage on NATO territory, these countries have to be consolidated and consulted. So, which brings me to that. This is often shown on all the conferences I'm normally going to, and it's going to show how many nuclear weapons everybody has, and then we look at the United States and we see 5,044, and we see on the Russian side 5,080, and we say, oh wow, that seems pretty equivalent. Okay, right. However, that is not making a difference between tactical and strategic weapons. And that's important. So, the definition of a nuclear weapons. So I can debate it all day long. We don't have to call them tactical, we can call them sub-strategic, whatever you like. Don't really care, but we need a military vocabulary for the nuclear sector, which is agreed by all allies. Because the trouble is, what constitutes a tactical nuclear weapon, for instance? Is it the yield? No, it's not, because I can dial it up, dial it down. So I can, for example, have 0.5 kilotons and up to 150 kilotons. That's a major difference. The employment method. How do I want to use them? Do I want to actually use it against bunkers? Do I want to use it against troop formations? Am I attacking cities with it? Interesting. Range as well. Range is often depicted as a factor. I would highly dispute that, because you can always, extend the range, especially of aircraft. and therefore you already have that limited. Then the doctrinal thinking, I think that's where it gets interesting. How do we envisage the usage of nuclear weapons, or how do we respond to nuclear usage? I'm not only saying we are using them, but how do we respond as a fighting force to their usage? And how do we account for that in our decision-making process? So, what makes nuclear weapons so unique? First of all, we have a lot of firepower on a small scale. So even an F-16 can carry up to 2 B-61s, which is an enormous firepower. So we have, for one, the fireball, and I think not many people are aware of that. A nuclear weapon is primarily a fire weapon. It's similar to thermobaric weapons used, for example, in the Soviet Union or in the Russian Federation now, like the TOS-1. However, I have other aspects with it. So I have the overpressure, which goes out and basically kills the personnel. I have the fallout later. I have the EMP, which is often overlooked because we haven't hardened our electronic devices for a long, long time now because that's expensive. And we have cratering. So basically I can, especially if I, for example, have an earth detonation, so which means it goes in the ground for about 10 to 12 meters and then detonates, I can have a massive crater. And that can hinder, for example, combat operations of armored formations, and especially if I use more than one. And of course, I have a psychological shock because everybody will see, wow, there's a nuclear explosion. I do not want to go in there. So therefore, any combat operation will come to a halt for at least a bit. Which brings me to NATO. That's from 1954 and the then Severin, because he basically proclaimed very early on that NATO should be prepared to take immediate military action in the event of aggression, including the use of nuclear weapons. And early on. So, for example, the Bundeswehr, which always, is a bit hesitant now about nuclear weapons or, being associated with them, was actually one of the first countries to plead for them. So, before any other formations were actually formed, the first officer to participate in an exercise was in carte blanche. That was a nuclear exercise for tactical nuclear usage in Bavaria. So, when we look at that, we see that NATO has its origin there. And yes, we have tried to come up with more conventional solutions for it, but we have not really come up with a solution to come up with an equivalent for it. Because the phenomenal thing about nuclear weapons is, and that's where, for example, the French army is a great example, it saves money. During the Cold War, they had a huge conscript force and a small elite force for the overseas territories. But however, that was intended because nuclear weapons should be on the same level, and therefore, for example, make it equivalent to the Warsaw superiority in conventional terms. And when we talk about the 1950s and the 60s and 70s, we also have this fascination with nuclear weapons. So for instance, the United States Army had the Potomac Army, and these formations should be infantry formations. That was actually implemented. It was only disbanded in 1962 after people found out that ideas such as the David Crockett, which is let's say a bazooka with an enormous warhead, was a terrible idea because you actually hit yourself. However, until that moment, before the first exercise, people thought it was a great idea to give even smaller units nuclear firepower. I'm not saying that, and this is really the extreme. What I'm suggesting is we need to be dealing with the fact, for example, that the Russian Federation is using tactical nuclear weapons and how we continue to fight in this environment. And that's probably where we need to go. However, and this is why I'm telling that about NATO, we have the situation that a division commander at NATO can always ask for tactical nuclear weapons support in a time of war. So how does that work? So the division commander has a tactical situation, let's say a nil breakthrough, and they basically can send a request to SHAPE and then to the SACEUR. And the SACEUR and SHAPE then make the request to the NAC if they haven't been authorized, to the North Atlantic Council. And that takes normally about 24 hours. So a pretty long time. And this is also where it comes to credibility. The Russian Federation knows this. They don't have that time delay. They can use it right away because they have a very straightforward decision-making process, which we do not have at NATO. Normally, we are relying on the US president and the US military to actually make a response in that case. Questionable if we want to be allies on the same level, because we actually are hiding behind that decision-making process. Then we have the other option, the bottom-down approach, where basically the SACEUR, probably not known by many, actually generates with his staff a nuclear strike plan with high value targets for example, in the Russian Federation or associated countries such as Belarus, for instance. So this plan is actually then implemented. It has nothing to do with the support as such. So therefore, we're coming back to my initial question. What constitutes a tactical nuclear weapon? Because if I can use it also strategically, like any other weapon, it comes down to what I would use it for. And therefore, we have a definitional problem. However, during the Cold War, we didn't have that problem of too little nuclear weapons. We had about 7,000 stationed in Europe, alone 4,000 stationed in Germany. Now, how many approximately, according to open source data, do we have now stationed in Europe?
300, 200.
We have about 100. And this is the entire US arsenal. So we're talking about 100 weapons which would also be used in the Pacific, for instance, because China is also doing their part in increasing their reliance on tactical nuclear weapons, especially when looking at the paperwork which has just come out last week from their political bureau. So lastly, I just want to quickly make an excursus. I mean, that's a different section, but about Russian nuclear tactical doctrine, because that's where we're coming down to the section, what do the Russians think about it? So I read an article the other day that they do not consider that nuclear artillery anymore. However, they consider their nuclear arsenal, especially on the tactical level, as special munitions. So you can call it as you want. They actually consider it as part of operational planning, and it's not a strategic asset. So for example, Iskander, which is stationed, for example, in Kaliningrad, has a flight time to Berlin of 2.5 minutes. So let's talk about decision-making time. We have a 24-hour decision-making for NATO, and we have 2.5 minutes flight time, if we detect it in time. So, which brings us to maneuver warfare, because the trouble is, we have the equivalent in strategic terms, but we won't use strategic nuclear weapons on Moscow just for an infringement, let's say on the Baltics, as hard as it sounds. I cannot realistically see that. So therefore, we have an absolute escalation dominance of the Russian Federation in terms of nuclear weapons and associated material. Also, for example, with mid-range conventional weapons. And if we look at Europe, we're also highly splintered. So we have, for example, France, who holds a completely different vision on nuclear weapons, and therefore we have a wild card in the middle. Because they hold the old vision of NATO that as soon as they get threatened, they fire the entire arsenal. However, here comes the big question, would they really? And this brings me back to the yes, Prime Minister part, would they press the button? I doubt it. So, last but not least, this is the current coverage of dual-capable Russian missile force. And why I want to point this out, because the Iskander system has two types of missiles, and you can basically reach a lot of NATO territory, and especially also in Ukraine. I know that the 729 has approximately a range of 2,500 kilometers, but it's not depicted on there because it's a different category of a weapon. It would be a mid-ranged, probably also a strategic asset. So, last but not least, what do I want to leave you with? And then I'm already done in 2 minutes. Is pretty much that the threat of tactical nuclear weapons is real, and we have a dramatic escalation deficit. However, and this is my however part, we should not be, going through this motion of responding to nuclear threats all the time, but actually having the nuclear capability to respond in kind. And then we should have the realistic interpretation of nuclear capabilities, because the Russian Federation has been expanding Iskander missiles at a quite huge rate, and even the ones which were designated for nuclear usage. So therefore, putting it into context. And last but not least, is that capabilities are relevant or irrelevant if the political will is not there. And especially when we talk about nuclear weapons, the will isn't there at the moment. So I cannot talk about a credible deterrent if the political will to use them is not there. And this is what I'm leaving you with. Thanks.